You know, they say drawing is the soul's way of taking a photograph. Is that true? I don't know, but it sounds good. Hello, and welcome to Fishbowl. We're out in Mexico, talking about drawing. Tackle some important questions, you know? How do you draw dragons? What makes them tick? Are aliens real? Is the buffet the reason why I had diarrhea last night? And sunscreen, you know? Is it just overpriced yogurt? We're gonna get to the bottom of it. We don't care who's at the top. Welcome to Fishbowl.
Okay, so I'm gonna walk through two approaches to water that I use in my work. The first being more of a traditional approach, all of the fingers and splashes, all the gravity of everything kind of moving directionally down and to the left here. I find that this is useful just to have everything kind of uniform. You know, it indicates a direction, everything's consistent. That kind of lends itself to just kind of feeling a little bit more traditional, in my opinion. So I think this is called for, and I'll use it from time to time. The bars of the water are very uniform. They kind of all carry the same direction, and every finger, you know, the consistency is there. In tattoos, I kind of find this satisfying looking. It just kind of looks consistent if everything is executed properly. The bodies of the splashes kind of being varying in size. This is a more chaotic approach, but again, trying to keep that kind of uniformity while changing the direction of each finger off of the crash of the wave. So I still have the uniformity in the background with the wind bars, but I'm creating a little bit more texture, getting a little bit more energy in there, but still kind of following the same principles as the traditional approach. I'm just getting a little bit more jazz in there, having some fun, making it look maybe a little bit more in the step of the direction of realistic water, or what it might look like on, you know, the open ocean. There's more crashing. You know, you can kind of see the froth, the tide, that kind of thing. But still kind of using a stylized version to illustrate that. But dialing up the detail, dialing up the action a little bit more. If the piece calls for it, I'll kind of go a little bit more this approach. Try and get a little bit more energy in there. Try and get some detail while still kind of keeping it readable. And again, I think the principles apply the same. You have your crash of the wave, but in each splash, the direction of travel in this particular style varies, while the body of the wave and the direction that it moves in stays the same. So here, speaking on each individual splash, maybe I'll give a few examples of how I would change that up. So water comes in, you have your center point, water goes out, this being very directional. Well, here I'm changing the direction of travel off of each individual finger, even redirecting it back up against the flow, but just a different variation. Maybe the body part calls for it. Here, the direction of travel changes, but you still have your center point, flows in and out. You could roll it in. You could go for a kind of directional change off of the same body of the splash. More traditional approach, the kind of a sharper finger, looks very directional, but you can choose your direction, vary it off of the body of the splash, go for a more rounded kind of approach, kind of a softer look to things, might set the vibe for your piece. Go for a very aggressive one-directional speed guy here, more of an oval than a rounded shape. Or a rounded shape with a redirection, kind of an aggressive throw off the top. Still suggests a lot of inertia, a lot of motion, and kind of a softer, more gradual way. So here I'll kind of attempt to show maybe an interaction with a rock. So as soon as you have an inanimate object thrown into the mix, now you have your layers. Water being a background element, if you're bringing things into the foreground, now you have an interaction. So it can kind of move over it. You have those layers, one splash going behind the rock, one splash going in front of the rock. Now you got a story. Now you're spinning a yarn. You can kind of show how they move around each other. Here you can suggest a very aggressive kind of rapids type thing. It's moving very quickly. That would suggest that the splash would be more aggressive, so you can play with that. All these factors, if you kind of look at them objectively, you can play with that. You can tell the story with how the water moves based off of how it interacts with your background elements. Here, this will kind of be more of a gentler, not so aggressive, kind of casual sort of climbing. You stack those waves in a very kind of dispersed way. Not as aggressive moving, not as speedy, more gradual, kind of a nice, sort of playful way to kind of illustrate them. But based off of the piece that you're making, that could fit a body part better than something moving more aggressive. Here you have your layers, foreground, midground, background. It suggests that things are moving backwards in a 3D space. So going from a rock to maybe a more elaborate kind of foreground element, I'll just whip up a koi here. And a koi fish is perfect in water because it gives you all of these excuses to play off of the fins in the same way you would the rock. So you have that kind of water moving over the tail. Now you have kind of, again, an object that's kind of moving through things and you're telling a story. So you can create those splashes, that direction over the tail. Should you choose to kind of put some splashes under or over, you're not necessarily trying to apply to physics here. Whatever you think aesthetically looks good. Placing those waves in a place where maybe it's going to sit on a body part properly and it needs to be there and still kind of adhere to how that fish is interacting with the water. Something here going very directional, up and to the right. Again, there's something kind of satisfying about how uniform that is. The entire piece moving in one direction. And here, same wave, same energy, but changing directions, some moving up, some moving down, directional change at the top. Maybe just a different story to tell, but aesthetically kind of looks the same to me. So maybe I'll pull this into more of a polished version of how I might paint or tattoo this or something, but being a little bit more selective with the lines that I'll use, maybe one step up from the sketch, kind of leaving those lines out of the transparency. I mean, a point I can't stress enough is how much restraint you use versus how much you're adding into the piece. So it says as much about the things that you leave out as the things that you put in. So all of those spaces and all of those lines, even at the bottom of the tail, the absence of lines kind of suggests that the water is clear, you have a transparency, it's moving through it. But this is just a little bit more of a solidified version of the sketch that I showed before. So I'll pull in some gray here to kind of show how what I would add and what I would also leave out. Negative space says just as much as color or shading. Those waves kind of being the relief from the piece, and then you're adding your contrast in the back. Here's a few variations of the waves, again, just being each individual splash, kind of based off of one central point, but you're choosing your direction of travel based off of what kind of speed or action you want to illustrate with the wave. So to get a little bit more detailed with how I'm drawing each individual finger and the pattern that I'm following with my hand, there is a way that I feel is more efficient, more expressive when you're drawing, and more efficient when you're tattooing. So inside of the curl, from the bottom up, around and back to the outside. So I'm sort of stacking it and creating layers on top of each other, and then circling back around the top of the wave. Same thing with your traditional approach, keeping that same direction. So from the bottom up and back around. It seems like just a more efficient way to move your hand when you're drawing it. Seems more flowy. The body of the wave, or the flow lines in a tattoo, is ultimately going to create two things. It's going to create your direction of travel. Maybe you can accentuate some muscles with it, but also it's going to be the way that you end the piece. So that's going to be your seam on a wrist or an ankle or the edge of a back. The top left being a little bit more traditional, kind of adhering to like an irizumi type of vibe, if that's the mood you want to set with the piece. Or moving down to the right, you're texturing it more while still keeping the energy of those wind bars, that Japanese kind of vibe to it. Looks very tattooy, but you're kind of implementing a little bit more texture, again, throwing some jazz into it, kind of making it more what it might actually look like in nature, while still kind of stylizing it, making it tattooy. So 1 being a little bit more traditional, 2 being kind of in the middle, and 3 being kind of a very more animated, stylized version of the same thing that you're trying to indicate, that flow of the body of the wave. So let's drop our friend here into a sleeve, and I'll attempt to illustrate how I might add our splash around him to accentuate the muscle groups of an arm. So this would be a right sleeve. So I want that koi facing forward, and then the wave behind his face I'm going to create into the chest to try and maybe leave the door open should this person add a chest piece. So the wave off the elbow is an attempt to kind of go for that sculpture kind of 3D thing, animate that feature of the body where the elbow protrudes. It's going to accentuate that wave. There's a consideration off the tricep moving out of the rear armpit. That relief is going to kind of bring that musculature forward. My head is on the ball of the shoulder, so that's sort of rounded. And a consideration for how the elbow bends. Maybe we'll use water as a back piece. This is our 3D mapping. So it protrudes off the top, it protrudes off the bottom. So again, that 3D sculpture sort of consideration is going to move everything forward on the actual client should you tattoo this piece. That top wave kind of fits with that protrusion. So it's going to come across from right to left. And then your flow lines, the body of the wave kind of brings everything backwards, giving it that kind of 3D dimensional type of thing. Same thing across the bottom, left to right. It's going to protrude out, and those things are going to be accentuated by the person's actual physicality. And you're kind of leaving it open for sleeves here. The top of the back being kind of a hard seam. Consideration for your love handles, that's the most expansive part of the back should the person's body change. Leaving the door open for leg sleeves at the bottom. So using the same language that I discussed, you could sort of just continue this piece on forever and have it kind of be cohesive using those same principles. Now I'll attempt to show a few pieces that I would actually draw for tattoos. On the left is a mermaid where the water is almost kind of an afterthought or a very small piece of the composition. But referring back to the texture chart that I made of the 1, 2, 3 kind of thing, that bottom kind of negative space moving through it would be a more textured, as far away from its tradition as I would go, but it still kind of creates an edge if you have any restrictions as far as other tattoos or things around it where you have to end the tattoo. Kind of brought that in to suggest that it's water, but there's no splashes, there's no finger waves. It just kind of ends the piece and still suggests you sitting on a rock. On the right, again, more flow than splash, but those few kind of fingers that are in there, in my opinion, it kind of just gives it that vibe. More tattooy, and kind of works as a nice background feature to kind of frame out that fish that's moving forward and protruding in front of the fisherman.
All right, that's a wrap for me. Thanks for watching, and greetings from Mexico.